Hi, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Mike LeCouture. Tonight, the art of cabinet making.
I think he's shown a willingness to evolve policies, but we have to let the government be sworn in.
Mark Carney will swear in his cabinet Tuesday morning. Tonight, we talk to a panel of people who have been chiefs of staff to prime ministers to take us behind the scenes on the process. Then, is all that 51st state talk a thing of the past?
From my standpoint, from the president's standpoint, 51st state's not coming back. The president may bring it up.
Trump's newly minted ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, tells the National Post that the president has moved on from his obsession with annexation. Our front bench will assess the Canada-U.S. relationship at the end of a big diplomatic week. Plus, challenges with national unity coming from the West. Exclusive new polling shows a Mark Carney government could bring the country together. But first,
The first cabinet meeting after Mr. Carney became prime minister, he got rid of the retail carbon tax. Pretty important in parts of the country like New Brunswick, where I come from. I think he's shown a willingness to evolve policies, but we have to let the government be sworn in, and we have to let the prime minister talk to the premiers over the next couple of weeks.
So that was the Minister of International Trade and Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc, in an interview that's set to air this weekend on CTV's Question Period with Vassy Kapelos. Now, as you heard there, the cabinet still has to be sworn in, and we now know it'll happen next Tuesday, May 13th. So will Dominic LeBlanc keep his job, or will he be moved into a different portfolio? Now, he was critical enough to be in that meeting inside the Oval Office this week, but is that enough for someone to keep in that job? 1 week ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney committed to a, quote, efficient and focused cabinet, one also with gender parity. So how difficult will that be, and how tricky is the process of making a federal cabinet? Joining me now are two people who have some experience in that. Eddie Goldenberg was Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He's now Senior Advisor at Global Public Affairs. And David McLaughlin was the Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Thank you both for being here. I appreciate that.
Glad to be here. Pleasure.
So, Mr. Goldenberg, take us inside the process. How difficult is it to sit down, look at all the names, and place them in the right chairs?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that that is a decision made by the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister alone. He may consult a few people, he may not, but it is very much the Prime Minister's decision. I think cabinet for every Prime Minister depends on that Prime Minister's priorities and how that Prime Minister intends to govern. Obviously, there are a couple of things that are useful for everybody. There has to be regional representation, not necessarily from every province, but regional representation. And you want ministers who are going to perform well, you hope, in the House of Commons. But in terms of Mr. Carney, he has said that he is not there for business as usual. He wants to do some big things, and he will form a cabinet in order to do that. His priority, he has two major priorities. One is Canada-U.S., and you'll see whatever ministers he chooses. I'd say Canada-U.S. and international geopolitics and geoeconomics will focus on that. He also wants to focus on the economy, and not in a business as usual way. So he'll put together an economic team that allows him to deliver. And I think what Mr. Carney is going to look for is delivery, not talk. And we'll see how, and he will judge his ministers on their ability to deliver on his priorities. Another one, for example, he's talked a lot about housing. So he's going to have a housing minister who will be expected to deliver.
Yeah.
And he's going to choose that. Who he consults is entirely up to him, whether he consults widely or with two people or in front of the shaving mirror in the morning.
Yeah.
It's entirely up to him.
And Mr. McLaughlin, I think it's interesting because to try and convince some candidates to run, sometimes you tell them, hey, look, I believe you're a star candidate. Maybe I'll get you a cabinet position. How key is that in trying to measure who goes in and who doesn't?
Well, most prime ministers are or leaders of parties going in are very careful about, overtly promising a cabinet position because it gets out.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep any secrets in official Ottawa. And so it taints the dynamics a lot. Ultimately, it is the personal, as Eddie said, it's the personal choice and decision of the Prime Minister. And so there is art, but there is some science to it. Regional representation for sure. And he now has some seats. There's a seat in Saskatchewan, there's a couple of seats in Alberta, has some seats in Vancouver Island, for example. So these things go into the mix. Quebec delivered big time for the Liberal Party, so he has some more choices there. But he clearly did reach out to some people to have them, run. He recruited some candidates. So if he, I'm sure he didn't overtly promise a cabinet position, but he is certainly going to give them some due consideration. And if he wants to make this cabinet and his government different from the government that he, of his predecessor, which I think has to be a political priority, then he is going to have some new faces who have not been in Parliament before, new to the Liberal Party, and will be new around the table.
How important is that, though, Mr. Goldenberg, when you consider you also need experienced people in this moment? This is a moment that is different than any other we've seen in our history when you consider where we are with the United States and globally as well. So he really does have to have a mix, doesn't he?
Yes, I'm sure he does have to have a mix. I think it's really important to have a cabinet with some people who've been ministers before, who know how it works, and it's important to have new people. The thing that I would say is, from what David said, one of the problems he faces, and all prime ministers face, is how big does he want the cabinet to be?
Yeah.
The bigger it is, the easier it is, in a sense, because you can put more people in. I think Mr. Carney, from what he has said, would probably prefer to have as small a cabinet as possible, understanding the need for regional representation and all of that. And the smaller the cabinet, the tougher the decisions. But Prime Minister Carney is looking for delivery. Yeah. And you don't necessarily get delivery with 40 people or 45 people around a table. Yeah, so he understands that. So it's a balance he's going to have to take, and he'll look at it. He'll announce his cabinet on Tuesday, and he won't judge his cabinet by the reaction from people on Tuesday afternoon. He'll judge it over the next course of 6 months or a year. If he finds that people are delivering well, great. If he finds people aren't performing up to his expectations, he'll change them. And we'll see where it goes from there.
Yeah, and Mr. McLaughlin, he had said a focused cabinet, and we saw that in that first cabinet making. And really, it seemed, as a lot of people had called it, almost like a wartime cabinet because of the situation. He's also said he wants to make sure that there's gender parity. That was something that was started under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. How important is it for a prime minister to make sure that his cabinet not only is effective, as Mr. Goldenberg was saying, but also reflects Canada as a population?
Well, our first cabinet maker, Sir John A. Macdonald, said, give me better wood or better timber and I'll build you a better cabinet. I mean, you work with what you've got. Yeah. That's the reality. But within that, yes, you set some priorities. So competence, as Eddie's talking about, he has to deliver on what he's talked about. And he is a different kind of prime minister from Mr. Trudeau in his, I think, focus on issues and policies and priorities. He's going to come at things a little bit differently. So competence, first of all, but reflective of the country. So that's the regional piece of it. But we have made some strides, if you will, in social terms of having gender equality, gender equity across. And so that is certainly something the Liberal Party cares about. And so I think he will try to make that happen. Within that, if he sacrifices competence so overtly, for example, and puts somebody in a senior position for gender reasons or regional representation reasons who is clearly not up to the job, then he's going to find himself in the position that Eddie's talking about, and in 6 months or a year, he's going to have to change that person. That's never a good look for a prime minister, right? So he's going to put these things into the mix, but it will say something to Canadians. We will not judge, exactly on that first day, but we will get first impressions and very good impressions about what's important to him. Housing. If he puts a strong minister in housing and says that's what we need to do, okay, that's pretty clear. Look at the energy and environment portfolios with what's happening with Western Canada. I mean, job one of any prime minister is always national unity. And so these are symbols, if you will, and cues to the rest of the country as to his priorities and the politics of how he's going to approach for it. So good chance.
I just add to what David said, but competence is not restricted to white males.
No, for sure.
He can have a gender-balanced cabinet with very competent people, male and female.
Absolutely.
So, I don't think that is going to be a problem for him.
But how short of a leash will he have? To the point the two of you were making, also in terms of what Mr. Carney is like. And I say that very businesslike from what we've seen. Even that first cabinet meeting, cameras were allowed in. It looked very much like a CEO sitting around a table with his board. How, not to say how hard will he be, but I'll come back to that question. How much of a leash do these cabinet ministers have to make sure that they're delivering at the pace that he wants them to?
I think he will expect delivery. He will also expect ministers to be ministers. Most areas of government, he won't focus on. He'll focus on, like, laser-like on a few priorities, on Canada-US, on the international economic situation. He's going to focus on the economy, and he's going to let his ministers be ministers. And he will judge them on their ability to deliver. But he's not going to tell them, every day. He's not going to call them in every day and say, this is what I expect from you tomorrow.
Right.
He's going to tell them what he expects from them when he appoints them, and then he's going to let them do their job.
Because they should be competent enough.
And that's what a good CEO does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Mike, and I'd be watching for what Eddie is talking about, because that's his style of governing. I mean, the style any prime minister brings is to governing is also the style of the government writ large. Yeah. And so every cabinet for new government, there's also announced cabinet committee compositions. So one of the things I think we should be looking for is, does Mr. Carney resurrect a policy and priorities committee, a smaller inner cabinet to help direct things and run things, or an operations committee, in order to have that focused, narrow, a line on the key issues. That he's going to have a smaller cabinet for sure than what Mr. Trudeau had. He's already demonstrated some of that. But these will tell us about how he's going to govern. Bigger cabinets, it makes everybody happy for a while, but it is harder to manage. You need an infrastructure underneath it, right, to do so.
I just add, Prime Minister Chrétien had very few cabinet committees,
right,
because he believed that he wanted ministers to spend time doing their job as ministers and not sitting around cabinet committees. That his predecessor had too many. Prime Minister Trudeau, the first, he felt had too many. I think Justin Trudeau had a great number of cabinet committees, which meant that ministers were spending most of their time talking around a cabinet table, often on issues that weren't their own departmental business, and didn't have that much time to work on their own departments. I think Mr. Carney, we'll see what Mr. Carney does. I'm sure he's looked at various options, and I suspect that the type of CEO he was, he's likely to have fewer cabinet committees than more cabinet committees.
Last word to you on that.
I agree with that, and I would think that we will get a very clear sense about what he wants to do first. What are the kinds of things that the priorities he's setting for the country with this cabinet? It's going to be a different kind of government from before, but this is really his first new cabinet. I mean, he set it out a little bit beforehand. This is actually where we'll see what he plans to do as Prime Minister.
That's right.
Bit of a preview about a month ago, and now we get the real show coming up. Okay.
Right.
Thank you both for being here. David McLaughlin, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Eddie Goldenberg, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Real pleasure having you here. Appreciate
Pleasure
you.
for us.
Thank you. So that was the science behind the cabinet making. We also know it's a bit of a sport, especially in this political bubble. So we have some premium prognosticators that are on Power Play with us today. They're going to give us their hot takes. Our front bench is Sabrina Grover, Anthony Kosh, Gurritan Singh, and Rachel Aiello. They'll be up in just a few moments. First, though, we're going to talk to them about Canada-U.S. relations. Following that meeting in the Oval Office, the new U.S. ambassador to Canada is saying that whole 51st state talk is in the past. Well, is it really? We're going to ask the front bench right after this. Welcome back. So are Canada-U.S. relations turning a corner? Well, in an interview with the National Post, the new U.S. ambassador to Canada commented on the threats to Canada's sovereignty from our southern neighbors.
From my standpoint, from the president's standpoint, 51st state's not coming back. The president may bring it up every once in a while, but he recognizes it's not going to happen unless the prime minister engages with the president.
It's not coming back, really? Well, Pete Hoekstra says it's done, but is it? Let's bring in the front bench. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's senior advisor at Spark Advocacy and North Star Public Affairs. Anthony Kosh is a federal Conservative strategist and managing principal at AK Strategies. He previously served as national campaign spokesperson and director of communications to Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. We also have former Ontario MPP Gurtan Singh. He's now vice president at Crestview Strategy. He's also the brother of federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. And joining us in studio as well, CTV News national correspondent Rachel Aiello. Sabrina, I'm going to start with you on this one. So do we believe him? The U.S. ambassador? Or, who do we believe in all of this? The U.S. ambassador or the man who appointed him?
Well, I don't really think you can take Donald Trump at his word on any given day. Every day is a new adventure. So I would say we believe him temporarily for the immediate future. I will say that I think that the meeting that Mark Carney and President Trump had over this week was positive. And it looked a lot more positive than any of the other meetings I've seen Donald Trump have with leaders in the Oval Office. Certainly, if you look at that video that the White House produced after the meeting itself, it really gave Mark Carney a bit of a celebrity treatment and looked like President Trump respected Mark Carney, that he valued what he had to say and that he valued the approach that he's bringing from Canada. So I think that, as starting points, I believe that there is a good place for both of these countries to be negotiating. There's still a lot of room and time before we have to renegotiate CUSMA. The UK deal that the U.S. signed earlier this week also might give us some signals into how the United States is changing its approach, especially as the economic impacts of the tariffs and the stock crashes and some of the other actions that the United States has pursued actually take root and affect Americans. So I think, all in all, not every week is going to be like this, but not a bad week with Donald Trump.
Anthony, let's go back to the start of the week, Tuesday anyways, when what we heard from the Oval Office was Trump saying it takes two to tango and then also never say never. So even just in that, it was a bit of a mixed message. What are you taking away from the U.S. ambassador to Canada and what he's saying, which sounds a little more definitive?
I think the president is a troll. I don't think that's going to be a surprise to very many Canadians. Canadians have been clear. There's no real domestic interest. If there was ever, there certainly is none now on the Canadian side of things in wanting to join the United States of America. So is Trump the most unpredictable guy who likes to say random things on camera at every available opportunity? He's probably still going to bring this up a few times. Yes. And I expect that will very much be the case, as we just discussed, as CUSMA negotiations start to heat up. In order to put some gasoline on the flames, I have no doubt that he's going to say some inflammatory things. But at the end of the day, it was nice. Again, it does speak to how much our expectations have lowered. But it was nice to hear the President of the United States refer to our Prime Minister by his proper title, even give him a few compliments, and drop the whole governor shtick and all that other sort of stuff. So at the end of the day, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. Canada is not going to become the 51st state yesterday, today, or any point in the future. I think there were some positives to take away from the meeting, though some of them I just outlined. But at the end of the day, I do think it's important that we also recognize that not much has really changed. We're still and obviously, we just had an election. There's a lot of negotiations to happen from this point forward. But there's been some improvements, and I'm choosing to be optimistic, as I think Canadians should be.
Gurtan, if they're feeling optimistic, how are you feeling about this, especially with what Hoekstra said, I should say, and what that means for negotiations going forward, because those are going to start in earnest eventually.
So I'm optimistic about the Prime Minister's approach to Trump so far. I think about the memes making their rounds on TikTok of him saying never, 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 like mouthing it 30 times, it seemed like, when in response to the 51st state comment by President Trump. But that being said, I think this might even be a tactic by President Trump, like the whole yo-yo thing. He wants to put you on the offensive, then he wants to disarm you a little bit, then bring it back a bit. So I don't think we can trust anything that the president says, and I think he wants to destabilize. Remember, for President Trump, chaos is a virtue. For him, he thinks being chaotic, being unpredictable, being someone who keeps you at the edge of your seat is a way that you actually get advantage in negotiations. And I think the stability we saw in response, in quite contrast by the Prime Minister, is a good thing, especially given all this uncertainty. So I will definitely be holding my breath in this context. I think we should all be collectively and just really, make sure that we're putting in place as much protections as possible, given things without giving it to the pun go south again.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Rachel, because to Gerdeten's point, we've seen this movie before.
Yeah.
We didn't know what the sequel would look like, but it's starting to have the same plot lines almost. I mean, Kelly Craft was the ambassador here to Canada in Trump 1, and she was more of a measured tone as well. Do you expect this, as Gerdeten was sort of painting as a picture of one maybe playing the good guy, the other one playing the bad guy in this?
Yeah, and we've seen that already play out within the Trump administration in D.C. between what Howard Lutnick was saying sometimes and what Trump would say. That is kind of that bounce back and forth. But yeah, you and I both covered the NAFTA renegotiations, and that was a consistently, targets would move, or it'd be a good signal, and then be a bad signal, and it would be this and that. And so while I think this meeting for Mark Carney was crucial, and certainly I think went as well as one could hope, it's going to be tested over and over and over again. It's not necessarily always going to be an Oval Office sit down. It could be, one of those side door chats at the U.S. Trade Office between him and whoever he picks as the international trade minister. And so there's going to be lots of key moments ahead. What I'm watching to see is whether the unity we're starting to see from the Conservative Party, for example, and wanting to say that they want Canada to get a good deal, and what kind of role the NDP will play, how that coalesces, and if that solidarity or that Canada unity that we're seeing in the short term after the election holds strong as these negotiations get tougher.
And how important is that, Sabrina, that the solidarity holds strong, but also that as a government, this Liberal government sort of stays there and says, okay, this was a good week, but we don't know what next week will bring, and maybe calibrate themselves in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's important for Mark Carney entering this new government to really maintain the relationships and the conversations and the openness with all of the premiers. I think that maintaining that conversation is going to be crucial to solidarity. I mean, we obviously seen some cracks in that, but I think that the ability for the Prime Minister to say that he has the premiers on his side and to be negotiating across the country, individually as they have, but with the same unified message and the same objectives and goals is really, really important. And then beyond that, I think the next real test for the Canada-US relationship, assuming nothing crazy happens in the next 5 weeks, which I can't say for definitively, is the G7. So what does that G7 look like, and how does President Trump interact when he's actually in Canada with Mark Carney and all of the other leaders as well? So I think that that'll be probably one of the biggest tasks that Prime Minister Carney and his cabinet are going to have to, Photoshop even in coming into what it looks like in the next couple of weeks here.
Anthony, how important is this G7 compared to how the last G7 went and ended, frankly?
Yeah, well, I definitely think Canadians are hoping for some contrast. But again, this is sort of the beginning. There's a lot of moving parts right now. We've got the same government with a new head, but a new president who's also a former president. So it's kind of funny in that regard. But obviously, this is going to be the big docket on the item. I'm curious to see who the Americans actually send as a part of their delegation. But at the end of the day, I mean, it sounds like we're talking about the same thing every week. Donald Trump tariff threats, Donald Trump tariff threats, Donald Trump tariff threats. But it's, again, the number one topic on most people's minds, as it should be. And I'd like to say that I had more insights into this than I do. But I guess when it comes to the president, you just sort of have to wait and see and hope for the best while expecting the worst.
Gordon, what do you think that Canada should do in terms of the G7? Not to say that we roll out the red carpet, but really they have to sort of calibrate themselves differently this time, right?
I think what we saw from the Prime Minister during his interaction with the President is a bit of like a microcosm for how he should engage within the greater context of the G7, which is being firm on the issues that matter most. So our sovereignty, making sure we're getting a good deal for Canadians. At the same time, though, having that openness, given the relationship that we need with the Americans and with President Trump. I think the way that the Prime Minister balanced that was a smart thing. And I know for Canadians it might be difficult to see that all the time, but ultimately he needs to get a good deal for Canadians, and having the firm stance on what's most important, which is our sovereignty and our tariffs, and then having that openness and welcomeness on the other side could be advantageous to disarming Trump. Because if we're just head to head, it could result in more friction, and ultimately we need to make sure we're building paths, despite the chaos and the inappropriateness coming from Mr. Trump.
Yeah, and Rachel, in closing, it seems like they're off to a better start, because when he talked about that 51st state thing and saying Canada's not for sale, a lot of places aren't for sale, like this place, talking about the Oval Office in the White House or Buckingham Palace. And he made Trump laugh. It almost felt like that was a moment, right?
Yeah, I would love to know who came up with that line. But I think going back to the G7, it'll be interesting to see how the other world leaders handle Trump in that dynamic. We've seen one-offs between Trump and other world leaders, and some of them, Trump has talked disparagingly about Canada during them, and those other world leaders haven't had our back. Do they pull that again in Canada, or is this an opportunity for Mark Carney to shore up support and kind of show Donald Trump, hey, us and all of these other very economically powerful allies are aligned on this, and we're not going to tolerate it?
Yeah. Okay, we're going to have to see when that eventually happens in Kananaskis, Alberta. We're also going to have to wait for our next subject, because that's after this short break. When we get back, everybody's going to break out their crystal balls and their hot takes. It's cabinet speculation season, and guys, we're here for it. Power Play, we'll be right back after this. Okay, so we're just a few days away from Mark Carney's cabinet swearing in. And in Ottawa, that means that political reporters and pundits are probably making bets about who's in and who's out. Here are some of the key faces to watch for, and I'm going to do my best to get through all of them quickly and not mispronounce any of them. Okay, the people that you already know in cabinet: Dominic LeBlanc, Mélanie Joly, François Champagne, Anita Anand, and Chrystia Freeland. Some of them could be moved. There's also some high-profile rookie MPs coming in, maybe into cabinet. Tim Hodgson, former special advisor to Mark Carney at the Bank of Canada. He was also the former CEO of Goldman Sachs Canada. That probably puts him in the running. There's also Claude Gay. He's the former CEO of IBM Canada. Carlos Leitao, he's the former Quebec finance minister. And of course, we have Nathalie Provost, an engineer and survivor of the École Polytechnique massacre. There's also 3 current ministers who only just got into cabinet right before the election: Ariel Kayabaga, Cody Bloy, and Ali El-Sassi. Those are people that we are watching for. A lot of names to pour over, but don't you worry, our front bench has their picks and their hot takes on who they think who could be in and who could be out of cabinet. So let's bring them back. We have Sabrina Grover, Anthony Kosh, Gurritin Singh, and Rachel Aiello. Sabrina, you get to start us off with your 2 picks. Who do you think could be moving?
Is this our Coachella? Like, is this Coachella for nerds? I think it is. Okay, my picks are, I think that Leslie Church is a rookie, but I think that she is in. She came back from a by-election loss in June to win this seat in this round, and I think that she's quite talented, has a depth of experience from both her staffing time as a staffer and prior to that. So I see her coming in possibly in foreign affairs or maybe international trade. And for returning,
that's a hot take.
I would say is that's why I'm here. Mel's not here, so that's what I'm doing today. And then I think from our returning cabinet ministers, I think that FPC François Philippe Champagne, I see him moving possibly into the infrastructure role. I think that as we see Canada really double down on domestic strengthening and think about some of these big projects that need to take place inside our borders, I think that FPC brings the talent from ISED. He managed some massive deals on that side, and I think that he is somebody that's relatable to the provinces, somebody that's likable, and I think that that's going to be that could be a great role for him.
Equally hot take because of where he is right now. Anthony, your shot.
So for a newcomer, the newbie, who's not really all that much of a political newbie, I'm a Montreal boy like you, Mike, and Carlos Leitao was a widely heralded, very successful Minister of Finance in Quebec from 2014 to 2018. In fact, he was so popular and so widely well regarded that when the CAQ ran in 2018 to unseat his government, which they were successful doing, even they had to heap praise for his management of the finances of the province, and went as far as to basically reassure voters and saying, don't worry, we're not going to deviate too far from what Mr. Leitao had cooking. So I very much expect to see him come in either the Treasury Board position or potentially maybe even be considered for finance, given his pedigree, both in the private sector, but also as finance minister for Quebec. And I think a broader comment I am expecting a relatively Quebec-heavy cabinet from Mark Carney for a number of reasons, partially related to his overperformance in the province in the last election. And then for the people that are already in cabinet, it's been widely circulated already, the rumor mill. Who always knows what to make of that in Ottawa? But there's been a lot of talk about Mélanie Joly being moved out of the foreign affairs minister position. Obviously, in the context of a general election campaign with all the stuff that was coming out of the United States of America, there was no chance that Mark Carney was going to make any changes in that position in the pre-election context or even during the election, obviously. But now that their mandate's been secured and there's been some very impressive people elected that are going to be making it into cabinet, and some already people who've held high-profile cabinet portfolios that are going to be remaining in cabinet, I think we should expect to see her moved somewhere else and somebody else to take that job. She's been widely regarded as a bit of a laggard or poor performer in that position. And I think if you're looking at major incumbent ministers that are supposed to be moved around, I think she's probably somewhere near the top of your list.
Yeah, and back to Leta, when I worked in Montreal as a young reporter, I would interview him on a number of occasions. He was the chief economist at Laurentian Bank, so that is more adding to his pedigree. You know, Rachel, you're next. Who do you have?
Yeah, so for my pick for who I think is getting in is Tim Hodgson. He won in Markham Thornhill. He was the former Goldman Sachs banker. Yeah. And I just want to read you a little bit of praise he's received. Tim Hodgson is one of Canada's top investment bankers. He is widely recognized for his exceptional transaction skills and understanding of how markets work. Who said that? Mark Carney. Mark Carney said that when he was named to be his special advisor at the Bank of Canada. So clearly these two men have a strong working relationship. I'm expecting him to come in some capacity. My guess would be finance, although that might be a bit too obvious. We shall see. But I do think he is a strong contender and an Ontario minister to get into the fold. As for the hot take on who I think could be moving is actually someone who I think isn't. Chrystia Freeland in internal trade. I know she's one of the ones we keep talking about in this cabinet shuffle in the context of is she still going to be in? And I think she is, specifically because of the job she has right now in this interprovincial trade role, because Mark Carney has promised Canadians to lift interprovincial trade barriers by Canada Day. It'd be quite a choice to move her out with that deadline fast approaching.
Yeah, and likely internal trade, not international trade.
Right.
Given
far away from Donald Trump.
Far away from Donald Trump, who didn't name her, but certainly mentioned her on Tuesday. Gerdeton, you're up.
So the interesting take, I think, is we're going to have McKinnon back into his position as minister. I believe it's called Jobs and Families. And the question, though, is, will they take the response from those in the labor movement who said, we need a minister of labor? So that's the question I have. I think there was a pretty clear communication from labor leaders when there was that ministry was no longer there, or was renamed, rather. But given how we've seen this southwestern sweep of conservatives across Windsor and these other areas, I think it's important that the Liberals communicate that connection to labor again. So having him not just in that role, but that specific label of labor, I think that's going to be really important to keep an eye out for how that plays out. And secondly, I think Gregor Robertson from BC, former mayor of Vancouver, big name, big profile individual. I believe have a position in cabinet. What position? That's to be determined. But I just think, given his profile, given that their performance was, I think, not exactly what they did well, the Liberals, but I think they want to do a bit better potentially in BC. I think he becomes a good anchor, a good communicator for that region. Yeah,
and Sabrina, some of these people don't run if they don't think that they're going to have a high-profile job. And I mean, look, everybody runs to serve, and I don't want to assign any type of intent on any of them, but certainly one would have to think that that is what they're thinking. So there probably is some pressure on Mark Carney. The other pressure on Mark Carney is trying to make sure that this doesn't look exactly like the last cabinet under the last prime minister. How much do you think that is figuring in his decisions over the next couple of days as he finalizes this list?
I think there's very little chance that it looks like the last cabinet. I mean, we had this conversation when he did this cabinet shuffle after being elected as leader, and there was almost no opportunity for it not to look like the last cabinet because he hadn't elected a bunch of new MPs yet. With the, vast incoming of talent into this government, I think there's a huge opportunity to shake things up. And a lot of the people that were elected do bring a lot of talent and specialized experience, as you've heard just on this, on this in this round. I think what will be interesting is to see what is the size of cabinet. Is it as small as he announced right after his leadership, or does it expand? I think it's going to need to expand. I think that was really kind of a wartime cabinet, as he may have called it, but it's going to need to expand. You can't have things like Indigenous Affairs and Attorney General in the same cabinet position. Even families and jobs, I think that those are going to have to come apart. So I think there's room to expand a little bit, and I think it'll be interesting to see kind of where the rookies might go into those positions.
And it's interesting, though, Anthony, because, yes, there are people with experience that are coming into government that he could possibly trust in those roles, but there are also key roles. And I'm thinking of somebody like Dominic LeBlanc, who it sounds like, from everything that we're hearing behind the scenes, has a good relationship with Howard Lutnick, his sort of, the counterpart that he has south of the border. And he is somebody who was a good friend of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So if he stays in his position, what will opposition parties say about how different this cabinet really is?
Yeah, I mean, listen, opposition parties are always going to try to find things. As somebody who's been a part of the scripting of these very kinds of attack, that's part of your job, is trying to find sort of things to criticize. But I think, and one thing that I've been saying internally to Conservatives that has upset a lot of people, is that as far as your typical Canadian is concerned right now, they have a new government. Even if a lot of the people, the moving parts, are similar to the ones that we saw before, as far as normal, regular, relatively nonpartisan people are concerned, they feel like they've actually gotten some change. Okay? So maybe that will change. It's possible over the course of the next few years, if Mark Carney makes some missteps, people will say, oh, it's just the same old Liberal Party. But I actually do think that in the meantime, he's got a lot of good graces, and people will be relatively benevolent. So I don't think it's as simple or as required right now for him to sort of line up everybody who had a personal relationship with the former prime minister and send them out to pasture. And I think that somebody like Dominic LeBlanc, it's a very easy spin. If I was a Liberal and I was explaining why Dominic LeBlanc needed to stay in cabinet, I'd just be honest and I'd list the exact reason that you just did, which is he has decent relationships with American officials, and right now that's kind of something that Canada is in short supply of and in great need of. So I'm not so concerned about that. I don't think the Liberals should be too cocky and take advantage of this goodwill, but I think they also should be reconnaissant of the fact that they do have this goodwill.
Gerdeton, what do you think in that, in terms of how do they spin this cabinet?
I think the reality is, at this current moment, the criticism that they're going to face around there being the same cabinet or the new cabinet is, as said earlier, it's not going to be something that Canadians really care about right now. They see a new prime minister. It is a new government. And I would say for opposition parties at this time, that kind of really, clear partisanship there's not an appetite right now amongst Canadians for
Agreed.
that. Canadians right now want someone who's going to just take care of these really pressing issues. What did we just hear about the GM plant in Oshawa, that there's further closures there? Like, as we have these conversations, we have to understand there's a very real impact to working people right now. Unionized jobs, workers across the board, they're losing their jobs. And they're not going to be, there's no appetite for this, kind of mudslinging around, oh, you have the same cabinet, another cabinet. They want to just have a clear leadership standing up to these tariffs and guiding Canadians, hopefully towards a path where we can maintain our economy, maintain jobs, and maintain the services that people rely upon.
Okay, unfortunately, I have to leave it there. I appreciate everybody's input. Sabrina Grover, Anthony Kosh, Gerdeton Singh, and Rachel Aiello, thank you so much for being with us. Coming up, though, could a Carney government help improve national unity? We've got exclusive new polling with Nick Nanos coming up right after this.
I was pretty blunt. I said, it's time that your government starts showing some love to Saskatchewan and Alberta. The last prime minister showed no love.
This is something that we will get an indication of very quickly, of whether or not he's willing to turn the page on the past 10 years and move forward in a different direction. And I'm hopeful that he does.
We very much believe that there's a path forward with this new prime minister and whoever is in his cabinet for him, and his government to change course from a policy perspective.
I certainly encourage them all, Premier Smith, Premier Moe, and I believe that they're on board for this, to work together and to push back strongly on any kind of separatist sentiment.
The issue of national unity is in the spotlight again as a referendum on Alberta separation was given new life by Premier Danielle Smith this week. We also heard from Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who said he hopes Prime Minister Mark Carney will do more to show some love to the prairie provinces. It comes as new numbers from Nanos Research show most Canadians believe that Mark Carney's government will have a positive impact on Canadian unity. According to the polls, 7 in 10 Canadians believe that the Prime Minister will have a positive or somewhat positive impact on unity among Canadians. Regionally, there's a lack of that optimism in the prairie provinces, where only about 55% of Canadians think that he will have that positive impact. Joining me now to dig a little deeper into the numbers is Nick Nanos. He's the CEO and Chief Data Scientist with Nanos Research. Hi, Nick. Welcome back to Power Play.
Great to join you.
So this new poll that you have out today for our show has some really interesting insights into how Canadians are feeling about unity in this country. Tell us what the numbers are telling you.
It's quite striking, Mike. You know, we asked Canadians for CTV News and Power Play what they thought the contribution that a Mark Carney government would be on national unity, whether it be positive or negative. And what's interesting is that when we ask Canadians this question, a pretty strong majority believe that he will have a positive or somewhat positive impact on the unity of the country. It's about 70% or thereabouts. So it's a pretty big number right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you dig into those numbers, there's a regional divide. And I sort of flash back to what Doug Ford, the Ontario Premier, said, that the previous government really wasn't showing any love for Saskatchewan and Alberta, and he actually said it was quite the opposite. So we have heard talk of a referendum on separation in Alberta, and that seems to be where the hope in these numbers isn't as strong. Talk to us about that.
Absolutely. You know, the numbers are lower, where there are about 7 out of every 10 Canadians. That number drops to just a little over 1 out of every 2 people that live in the prairie provinces. So still a majority, but lower than the rest of Canada. The other thing that's actually quite striking is you have to think of it this way, Mike. You know, the Liberals got around 43% support or thereabouts in the popular vote. More than 7 out of every 10 think that there'll be a positive or somewhat positive impact on national unity, which means there are some conservative voters who believe that Mark Carney will be good for national unity. But the reality is that the proof is in the pudding. What this speaks to is that there is hope currently on his impact on the state of the Federation, and it's too early to tell whether that hope will convert into reality, but there is an opportunity right now for Mark Carney and his new government.
And Nick, what I find interesting is that some of this hope isn't really reflected as much in, you know, how many Liberals were elected in those areas. Talk to me a little bit about that and how that sort of interplay didn't really show up in terms of numbers of MPs in the prairie provinces, but is showing up as hope right now.
Well, you know, we look at the numbers in the last federal election, and let's face it, the prairies are the conservative heartland. You know, that's where most of the conservative caucus comes from. You know, the Conservatives are extremely strong in the prairies. But, you know, what this does show is that even if you're in the prairies and even if you're conservative-minded, you're at a point in time where you likely believe that it's important for the country to start to work better, for the Federation to be stronger, especially in the face of the threat from Donald Trump. And I think what we're seeing is a situation where there is an opportunity right now for the Mark Carney government to engage in national unity, to bring the premiers from different provinces together, including Alberta and Saskatchewan, where a lot of this separatist sentiment exists, in order to show that Canada can work.
Yeah, and one of those opportunities might be the First Ministers meeting, which will be in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, on June the 2nd. Prime Minister Mark Carney says he will be there. How much do you think is riding on that meeting for Canadians to feel better about national unity? Not just the fact that he's going, but any kind of result out of it and what we will hear from those premiers coming out of it?
I think people are going to specifically focus not just on, you know, Premier Ford and Legault. They're going to want to hear and see what the Premier of Saskatchewan and Alberta, what they say about the meeting and coming out of the meeting. And whether there is something concrete. I think for a lot of Canadians, they've had enough talk. they want to see action. They want to see action from the federal government. They want to see action from the provincial governments, and they want to see those governments to work together in order to make our economy more resilient, in order to focus on prosperity and jobs, and also in order to navigate with the Trump administration.
So we have Mark Carney also forming his cabinet next week. How important is it for him to have some sort of regional representation from the prairies, even though they don't have a lot of MPs to choose from in that cabinet, as a bit of an olive branch, but also to try and really improve national unity? How important is that?
It's critically important, Mike. And the thing is, this is all about signaling. Not only will he need to have some individuals from the West, Alberta and Saskatchewan, in his cabinet, he's going to actually have to give them some real responsibilities. The fact of the matter is he can't have them in cabinet and then have them as juniors or people that are not significant players in the government, because he needs to demonstrate that every part of the country has an important role in his cabinet, and that everyone are players, and that they're focused and working together for the betterment of the country. So it won't be enough just to tick a box and put a body from Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba into cabinet. It's going to be important that he sends a signal in terms of them having also substantive responsibilities in terms of the future of the government and the future of the country.
Yeah, especially if he wants to do something about that national unity. Nick Nanos, the CEO and Chief Data Scientist from Nanos Research, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
Time for one more break on Power Play. We'll be right back just after this. One more political note before we let you go. A judge has ordered a recount in the Ontario riding of Windsor-Tecumseh Lake Shore. Now, Conservative candidate Kathy Borelli won by 77 votes over Liberal incumbent Eric Kuzmerchek. The Liberal candidate's lawyer had argued some of the rejected ballots should have counted. That recount is now set for May the 20th. There are now a total of 4 judicial recounts right across the country, and the federal Liberals do have 169 seats right now, still 3 shy of a majority. Programming note for you as we say goodbye. Prime Minister Mark Carney's cabinet will be sworn in the next week. We'll be having out live coverage of the ceremony for you. It all starts at 9:30 Eastern on Tuesday morning. You can watch it right here on CTV News Channel and ctvnews.ca. Well, that's your Power Play Week in Politics. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us. Have yourselves a great weekend, and stick around because today's top headlines are just ahead.